Clara Whitmore stood at the tall window of Wexbury Manor, watching rain streak down the glass like slow tears, and she already knew, before the letter was even opened, that something had changed in her husband's heart, or perhaps had never truly been there at all. The letter had arrived that morning, carried by a footman who would not meet her eyes. It bore the royal seal, thick and golden, and it was addressed not to her but to Edmund Ashworth, Duke of Wexbury. Clara had not been invited to read it. She had only been told in passing over a breakfast where her husband barely looked up from his plate that there would be a grand ball at the palace and that his attendance was required. She had waited for him to say the word "we." He never did. 3 years earlier, Clara had walked into this house as a bride nobody wanted to celebrate. Her family, once respected landowners, had fallen into debt after a series of failed harvests and a fire that destroyed half their grain stores. The Ashworth family, needing an alliance with old money and a name still untouched by scandal, had proposed a marriage. It was not romantic, it was arithmetic. Her father's debts would vanish, and in exchange, Clara would become a duchess in name, though never quite in practice. She remembered her wedding day with a strange, hollow clarity. The chapel had been beautiful, filled with white roses that she had not chosen. Edmund had stood beside her, tall and composed, his jaw set in the manner of a man enduring an unpleasant obligation. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Edmund had turned to her, taken her hand for the briefest moment, and then released it as though it had grown too warm to hold. There had been no cruelty in those early days, not the kind that left marks or drew blood. It was quieter than that and in some ways harder to bear. Edmund was polite. He inquired after her health. He ensured she had new gowns each season, that the house was warm in winter, that her allowance was generous. But he did not look at her the way a husband looks at a wife he chose. He looked at her the way a man looks at a ledger entry, something to be managed, balanced, and otherwise left alone. Clara was not a great beauty, and she had long ago made peace with this fact. Her hair was a plain brown, not golden or raven black like the women whose portraits hung in the Wexbury Gallery. Her face was pleasant but unremarkable, the kind of face people forgot within a day of meeting her. She had a small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood fall, and her hands, though gentle, were not soft. She had spent too many years helping her father with his accounts, holding a pen for hours at a stretch, to have the delicate fingers of a woman born to leisure. She had heard the whispers, of course. Servants believed that walls were more forgiving than they truly were. She had heard the upstairs maid tell the cook that the Duke was ashamed of his wife, that he avoided taking her to town, that he had once been overheard telling his valet he wished circumstances had allowed him to marry someone the world would admire. Clara had cried only once about it, on the night she overheard those words, sitting alone in her chamber with the candle burned low. After that night she had made a decision. She would not spend her life waiting for a man's approval. If Edmund could not see her worth, she would build a worth of her own, one that did not depend on his gaze. It began small. She started managing the household accounts more closely, noticing waste that the steward had overlooked for years. She corresponded with her father's old business partners, offering advice drawn from the years she had spent balancing her family's books. Slowly, quietly, without any fanfare, Clara began to build something for herself, something separate from the marriage that had been arranged around her like a cage built of good manners. She used a false name in her correspondence, a habit she had begun almost by accident and then maintained out of necessity. Women, especially duchesses, were not taken seriously in matters of finance and trade, so she signed her letters as Mr. Ashford, a name close enough to her married one that she never confused herself, yet distant enough to shield her from the judgment of a society that valued a woman's face over her mind. Mr. Ashford's advice proved sound. Word spread quietly among struggling estates that there was a shrewd advisor willing to help families rebuild their fortunes, discreet and reliable, never asking for public credit, only for a fair fee. Clara built this second life in the hours when Edmund was away at his club or his meetings, hours that had once felt long and lonely and now felt purposeful. On the morning the royal invitation arrived, Clara had just finished a letter to a struggling merchant family in the north, outlining a plan that would save their shipping business from collapse. She sealed the letter with her private mark, a small pressed flower design that only she and her most trusted correspondents recognized, and set it aside for the afternoon post. It was then that she heard raised voices from the study down the hall, Edmund's voice and that of his closest friend, Lord Henry Caldwell, a genial but sometimes careless man who often spoke more freely than he should. "You cannot simply not bring your own wife to a royal ball, Edmund," Henry was saying, his tone somewhere between amusement and disbelief. People will talk. People already talk, Edmund replied, his voice low and tight. I am tired of the whispers, Henry, tired of watching men's faces when they realize the Duchess of Wexbury is not the woman they expected. I cannot bear another evening of polite smiles hiding poorly disguised pity. So what will you do? Attend alone? There was a pause, long enough that Clara found herself holding her breath without meaning to. I have already asked Lady Seraphina Vale to accompany me, Edmund said finally. Her family is old, her name respected, and no one will question why she is on my arm. It will save us both the embarrassment. Clara did not gasp. She did not drop the letter she was holding, though her fingers tightened around the paper until it crumpled slightly at the edge. She stood very still in the hallway, feeling something settle inside her chest, cold and clear, like water freezing into ice. She had expected many things from her husband over the years: indifference, distance, the quiet coldness of a marriage built on necessity rather than affection. But she had not expected, until this very moment, to hear him speak so plainly of his shame, and to hear him plan, with such careless ease, to walk into the most important social event of the year with another woman on his arm while his true wife remained behind, unseen and unmentioned. She walked back to her chamber without a sound, her steps steady despite the storm building quietly within her. She sat at her writing desk, the same desk where she had built an entire secret life under a borrowed name, and she looked at her reflection in the small mirror across the room. The woman looking back at her was plain, yes, but she was not weak. She had built something real out of nothing, something Edmund did not even know existed. She had helped families the aristocracy had abandoned. She had earned the trust of men who would never have trusted a woman, simply because they did not know she was one. Perhaps it was time the world learned exactly who Clara Ashworth truly was. She thought of her father, gentle and broken by circumstance, who had taught her that dignity was not something given by others, but something carried within. She thought of the letters stacked in her private drawer, each one a small victory earned through her own mind and her own effort, unconnected to the title she had married into. She thought of Edmund's voice through the study door, so certain that she was something to be hidden, an embarrassment to be managed rather than a person to be honored. Clara opened the drawer of her desk and withdrew a folded piece of parchment, an invitation she had received only days earlier but had not yet opened, curious as she had been about its origin. It bore a royal seal as well, though a different one than the invitation sent to Edmund. She broke the wax and read the words within, her eyes moving carefully over each line. It was an invitation from the Crown itself, addressed not to the Duchess of Wexbury, but to Mr. Ashford, requesting the presence of the trade advisor who had quietly rescued 3 struggling noble estates from ruin, at the very same ball her husband intended to attend with another woman on his arm. For the first time in 3 years, Clara Ashworth felt something stir inside her that was neither sorrow nor resignation. It was resolve, sharp and clean as a blade newly forged. She would attend the ball, not as the plain, forgettable wife her husband was too ashamed to present. She would attend as herself, fully and completely, and let the truth reveal itself in front of every eye in that grand hall. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but Clara no longer felt the cold of it pressing against the glass. Something inside her had shifted, quietly and permanently, and there would be no returning to the woman she had been that morning. She rang for her maid, a young woman named Margaret who had served her since her arrival at Wexbury Manor, and had never once treated her with anything less than genuine warmth. "Margaret," Clara said, her voice steady, "I will need my finest gown prepared. And send word to my seamstress in town, I have an event to attend." Margaret's eyes widened slightly with surprise, for she had overheard, as servants often did, that the Duke intended to attend the ball without his wife, but something in Clara's expression stopped any question before it could be asked. "Yes, your Grace," Margaret said instead, and hurried from the room to begin the preparations. Clara remained at her desk a moment longer, looking down at the royal invitation in her hands, the one meant for Mr. Ashford, the secret identity she had built from nothing but her own determination. She folded it carefully and placed it inside her bodice, close to her heart, where it would remain hidden until the moment it needed to be revealed. Whatever happened at that ball, whatever expressions crossed her husband's face when the truth finally emerged, Clara intended to walk into that grand hall with her head held high, not as a wife her husband had chosen to hide, but as a woman who had quietly become far more than anyone in that ballroom could imagine. The storm outside continued through the afternoon, but inside Wexbury Manor, a different kind of storm was only just beginning to gather, one that no title, no name, and no careless words spoken behind a closed study door would be able to stop. The seamstress arrived within 2 hours, a small woman named Beatrice with clever hands and sharper eyes, the same woman who had quietly dressed half the merchant wives and struggling gentry that Mr. Ashford had helped over the past 2 years. Beatrice did not know that the Duchess of Wexbury and Mr. Ashford were the same person, only that Clara had always paid her fairly and treated her with a respect few noblewomen bothered to offer. "A royal ball, your grace," Beatrice said, measuring tape draped around her neck as she studied Clara with the careful eye of someone who saw people the way other women saw fabric, full of potential shapes not yet realized. "We will need something extraordinary. Something no one in that room will forget." Clara nodded, standing still as Beatrice began her measurements. "I do not want something loud," she said. "I do not want feathers or excessive jewels. I want something that makes people look twice, not because it shouts but because it is unmistakably fine." Beatrice smiled, a knowing curve of her lips. "I understand exactly what you mean, your grace, quiet elegance, the kind that makes louder gowns look foolish in comparison." Over the following days, while Edmund remained largely absent from the manor, occupied with meetings, and Clara suspected, arrangements regarding his evening with Lady Seraphina Vale, Clara busied herself with 2 separate tasks that ran like parallel threads through her days. By morning she was the Duchess, quiet and composed, overseeing the household as she always had, greeting Edmund with polite civility whenever their paths crossed at breakfast, never once revealing the storm that had settled beneath her calm exterior. He did not seem to notice any change in her, which did not surprise her. He had rarely noticed her at all. By afternoon she became Mr. Ashford once more, sitting at her desk with ink-stained fingers, finishing the final arrangements for 3 estates whose fortunes she had spent the better part of a year repairing. There was the Hartley family, whose shipping business had nearly collapsed after a series of losses at sea, and whom Clara had guided toward a new trade route that had since tripled their profits. There was the Pemberton estate, drowning in debt after an ill-advised investment, now stabilized through a careful restructuring Clara had proposed under her borrowed name. And there was the Caldwell family, whose finances Clara had quietly repaired without ever revealing to Lord Henry Caldwell, Edmund's own close friend, that his family's rescue had come from the pen of the woman his friend was too embarrassed to bring to a ball. The irony of this was not lost on Clara. She had saved the very people who now, without knowing it, moved through society believing themselves superior to a plain-faced duchess they barely acknowledged. On the 3rd day, a letter arrived from the palace confirming the details of the ball, along with a private note addressed specifically to Mr. Ashford. Clara read it twice, her heart quickening slightly despite her efforts to remain composed. The note explained that the Crown wished to publicly honor the anonymous advisor who had, through discretion and skill, prevented the collapse of several noble households, an act the king considered vital to the stability of the realm's finances. The identity of Mr. Ashford had remained a mystery even to the palace itself, communicated only through trusted intermediaries and sealed correspondence. Now the Crown requested that Mr. Ashford step forward at the ball to receive formal recognition, an honor rarely extended and even more rarely refused. Clara sat with the letter in her lap for a long while, watching the candle flame flicker against the darkening window. She had built this secret life carefully, protecting it from a world that would have dismissed her the moment they learned a woman's hand had guided such careful financial strategy. But now that world was asking her to step into the light, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she was not afraid. She thought of Edmund's words through the study door. Tired of watching men's faces when they realized the Duchess of Wexbury is not the woman they expected. She wondered what his face would look like when he realized the Duchess of Wexbury was not merely different from his expectations, but far beyond anything he had imagined possible. Margaret entered quietly that evening, carrying a tray of tea, and found Clara still seated at her desk, the letter now folded neatly beside her. "Your Grace, is everything well?" Margaret asked, setting the tray down carefully. Clara looked up, and something in her expression must have shifted, because Margaret's brow furrowed slightly with concern. "Everything is very well, Margaret," Clara said, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she meant it entirely. I believe I am about to become someone the world did not expect me to be." Margaret, who had served Clara long enough to recognize the difference between quiet sorrow and quiet strength, simply nodded and poured the tea without further question. Though her eyes carried a flicker of curiosity, she was too well trained to voice. Meanwhile, across the manor, Edmund prepared for his own evening with a different sort of unease, though he would not have named it as such even to himself. He stood before his mirror as his valet adjusted the line of his coat, and found his thoughts drifting, unbidden, toward Clara. He told himself it was practical, this arrangement with Lady Seraphina. She was beautiful, well-connected, and her presence beside him would silence the murmurs that had followed him since his marriage, murmurs about a duke who had settled for a plain wife to erase his family's debts. He told himself this was simply how the world worked, that appearances mattered more than sentiment, that a man in his position could not afford to be seen as anything less than fortunate in every visible way. And yet some small, uncomfortable part of him remembered the way Clara had looked on their wedding day, not resentful, not bitter, but quietly dignified even as she married a man who could barely look at her without calculating what the marriage had cost him in social standing. He remembered, too, the many evenings she had greeted him with polite warmth despite his coldness, never once complaining, never once demanding more from him than he was willing to give. He pushed the thought aside, as he had trained himself to do whenever guilt threatened to surface. Tonight was not about Clara. Tonight was about restoring his image among his peers, about proving that the Duke of Wexbury was still a man worthy of admiration, regardless of the marriage circumstances had forced upon him. Lady Seraphina Vale arrived at the manor that evening in a carriage trimmed with silver, her golden hair arranged in an elaborate style that caught the candlelight beautifully as she stepped down. She was, by any measure, a striking woman, confident in her beauty and fully aware of the effect she had on those around her. "Your Grace," she said, offering Edmund a practiced smile as he greeted her at the entrance, "I do hope this arrangement causes you no discomfort. I understand it is somewhat unconventional." "Not at all," Edmund replied, though something in his tone lacked its usual smoothness. "I am simply grateful for your company this evening." Seraphina's smile sharpened slightly, though she said nothing further on the matter. She had long harbored a quiet resentment toward the marriage that had placed Clara Whitmore, plain and unremarkable in her eyes, into a position Seraphina herself had once hoped to hold. This evening she intended to make the most of the opportunity fate had handed her, even if it meant standing beside a man who was, in truth, still bound to another woman by law. As Edmund helped her into the carriage, neither of them noticed Clara watching quietly from an upstairs window, her reflection faint against the glass, her expression unreadable in the dim evening light. She watched the carriage pull away down the long drive, carrying her husband toward an evening he believed would restore his pride. She let the curtain fall back into place and turned toward her own preparations. For tomorrow evening, the true ball would begin, and Clara intended to arrive not as an afterthought hidden away out of shame, but as a woman the entire kingdom was about to discover for the very first time. The following 2 days passed in a blur of careful preparation. Beatrice returned with the finished gown, a deep sapphire silk that caught the light in a way that made the fabric seem almost alive, simple in its lines but extraordinary in its craftsmanship, embroidered along the hem with a subtle pattern of silver thread that resembled trade routes traced across a map, a private joke only Clara herself would understand. Clara also spent those days finalizing her correspondence as Mr. Ashford, ensuring that every family she had assisted understood that their advisor's true identity would soon become public knowledge. She wrote personally to Lord Hartley, to the Pemberton family, and finally, with a steady hand despite the weight of the words, to Lord Henry Caldwell himself, Edmund's closest friend, whose family fortune she had quietly rescued without his knowledge. The letter was brief, professional, and revealed nothing more than necessary. It simply informed him that Mr. Ashford would be attending the royal ball and would welcome the opportunity to finally meet him in person, given the trust he had placed in her counsel over the past year. She sealed the letter with her private mark and sent it off with the evening post, knowing that within days, the careful walls she had built around her second life would begin to fall away, revealing the woman who had stood behind them all along. That night, as she lay awake staring at the ceiling of her chamber, Clara felt neither fear nor doubt, only a steady, quiet certainty that had been building within her for years without her fully realizing it. Tomorrow evening, she would step into a ballroom filled with people who had underestimated her for the entirety of her marriage, and she would let the truth speak for itself, louder and more undeniable than any gown or jewel could ever be. The royal palace glittered that evening, as though the stars themselves had descended to rest upon its towers. Carriages lined the long avenue leading to the entrance, each one releasing a fresh wave of noble guests dressed in their finest silks and jewels, their laughter and chatter rising into the cool night air like music before the true music had even begun. Edmund arrived with Serafina on his arm, and the effect was immediate. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the crowd gathered near the entrance, admiring glances following the striking pair as they climbed the marble steps together. Serafina wore this attention like a second gown, radiant and composed, while Edmund found himself nodding to acquaintances with a practiced smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Inside, the ballroom was a vision of gold and candlelight, its ceiling painted with scenes of triumphant kings and gentle skies, its floor polished to such a shine that dancers seemed to glide across still water. An orchestra played softly near the far end of the hall, the opening notes of the evening drifting through the air as guests continued to arrive in waves. "You look pleased with yourself," Serafina murmured as they moved deeper into the crowd, accepting glasses of wine from a passing servant. "I am simply relieved," Edmund admitted quietly, glancing around the room at the many familiar faces, none of whom seemed to question why his wife was absent from his side. For the first time in months, he felt the old comfort of belonging fully to this world, unburdened by the quiet embarrassment that had followed him since his marriage. They were soon joined by Lord Henry Caldwell, who greeted them both with his usual warmth, though his eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary on the empty space beside Edmund where a wife should have stood. "Edmund," Henry said, clasping his friend's hand firmly, "I confess I am surprised. I did not think you would truly go through with this." "It was the sensible choice," Edmund replied, though something in his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as his friend. Henry's gaze flickered toward Serafina, polite but not entirely warm. "Lady Serafina." "A pleasure, as always." "The pleasure is mine, Lord Caldwell," she replied smoothly, though there was a subtle edge beneath her charm, the kind only another woman skilled in social maneuvering might have noticed. As the evening progressed, Edmund found himself swept into conversations about trade, politics, and the upcoming harvest season, the familiar rhythms of aristocratic life settling comfortably around him. He danced with Serafina twice, each turn around the floor drawing appreciative murmurs from the watching guests, and for a time he allowed himself to believe that this evening would proceed exactly as he had planned. Yet beneath the surface of his satisfaction, a small unease continued to gnaw at him, quiet but persistent, like a splinter he could not quite locate. Several times throughout the evening, he caught himself glancing toward the entrance, half expecting, though he could not explain why, that something unexpected was about to occur. Across the ballroom, Lord Henry Caldwell excused himself from a conversation about grain tariffs and made his way toward a quiet corner near the refreshment tables, where a folded letter still rested in the inner pocket of his coat, one he had received only days earlier and had read now perhaps a dozen times. The letter from Mr. Ashford had arrived just as his family's fortunes had finally stabilized, and Henry had spent many hours wondering about the identity of the mysterious advisor who had guided his family through their darkest financial crisis without ever asking for public recognition. Mr. Ashford's counsel had arrived at precisely the right moments, always through careful, anonymous correspondence, always accompanied by sound reasoning that Henry's own advisors had somehow overlooked. Tonight, Mr. Ashford had promised to attend, and Henry found himself scanning the crowd with genuine curiosity, wondering which of the many guests filling the grand hall might be the man behind the letters that had saved his family's name. He did not, even for a moment, consider that Mr. Ashford might not be a man at all. Meanwhile, outside the palace gates, a second carriage approached, quieter and less ornate than the others, yet bearing a small emblem near its door that few would recognize unless they had reason to. Inside, Clara sat with her hands folded calmly in her lap, watching the golden lights of the palace grow closer through the carriage window, her expression composed despite the quickening of her heartbeat. She wore the sapphire gown Beatrice had crafted for her, its silver embroidery catching the moonlight in delicate flashes, and her hair had been arranged simply but elegantly by Margaret earlier that evening, a few soft curls framing her face without unnecessary ornamentation. She did not need excessive decoration tonight. She needed only the truth, and the truth, she had come to understand, was far more powerful than any jewel. As the carriage rolled to a stop before the palace steps, A royal attendant approached to open the door, bowing respectfully as he recognized the small emblem marking the carriage as one traveling under royal escort, a privilege extended only to guests the crown itself had specifically invited. "Welcome, my lady," the attendant said, extending a gloved hand to assist her descent. "The crown has been expecting your arrival." Clara stepped down from the carriage with quiet grace, the cool night air brushing softly against her skin as she looked up at the palace towering above her, its windows glowing warm and golden against the dark sky. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply breathe, feeling the weight of everything she had built over the past 2 years settle steadily upon her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a foundation strong enough to carry her forward. She had spent years being overlooked, dismissed, quietly diminished by a world that valued appearance above substance. Tonight, that world was about to meet the version of her it had never bothered to look for. Inside the ballroom, the orchestra had begun a new piece, and Edmund found himself once again scanning the crowd near the entrance, an unexplainable pull drawing his attention toward the grand doors even as Serafina spoke beside him about an upcoming gathering she hoped to host. He barely heard her words, his focus caught instead by a subtle shift in the atmosphere near the entrance, a ripple of hushed attention beginning to spread through the guests closest to the doors. A herald's voice rose above the music, clear and formal, carrying easily across the vast hall as the room gradually quieted in response to the announcement about to be made. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Crown wishes to introduce a guest of great importance to this evening's proceedings, one whose contributions to the stability of several noble houses have, until tonight, remained known only to a select few." Edmund felt Serafina's hand tighten slightly on his arm, though whether from curiosity or unease, he could not tell. Around them, conversations faded into silence as every eye in the ballroom turned toward the grand entrance, where a figure had just appeared at the top of the marble staircase leading down into the hall. Edmund's breath caught in his throat. Standing at the top of the stairs, bathed in candlelight, wearing a gown of deep sapphire silk that seemed to shimmer with every subtle movement, was Clara. But she did not look like the wife he had left behind at Wexbury Manor. She stood with a composure and quiet authority he had never witnessed in her before, her chin lifted, her gaze steady as it swept briefly across the gathered crowd before settling, for the briefest moment, directly upon him. The herald continued, his voice ringing clear through the stunned silence of the ballroom. "Presenting Duchess Clara Ashworth, trade advisor to the Crown, known to many of you through her tireless and discreet work under the name Mr. Ashford." A wave of gasps rippled through the ballroom, guests turning to one another in astonished whispers, disbelief and admiration mingling in equal measure across the hall. Lord Henry Caldwell, standing near the refreshment tables, felt the folded letter in his coat pocket suddenly grow heavy with realization, his eyes widening as he stared up at the woman he had spent years wondering about, never once suspecting she might be his closest friend's own wife. Serafina's hand slipped slowly from Edmund's arm, her earlier confidence faltering as the weight of the announcement settled over the room. Every eye that had once admired her beauty now turned instead toward the staircase, toward the woman Edmund had been too embarrassed to bring to this very ball. Edmund stood frozen amid the crowd, his heart pounding with a confusion of emotions he could not fully name, watching as his wife descended the staircase with a grace and dignity that outshone every jewel and gown in the room, and understanding, with a growing sense of horror, that he had spent 3 years failing to see the woman standing directly in front of him. The murmur that swept through the ballroom did not fade as Clara descended the final steps. If anything, it grew louder, guests leaning toward one another to whisper questions that none of them could yet answer with certainty. How could the quiet, plain-faced Duchess of Wexbury, a woman rarely seen at court functions, be the very same advisor whose careful guidance had saved 3 noble families from ruin? Clara walked forward with steady steps, her sapphire gown catching the candlelight with each graceful movement, and though her heart beat quickly beneath her calm exterior, nothing in her expression betrayed the nerves she carried. She had imagined this moment countless times over the past several days, yet standing within it now felt both stranger and more freeing than she had anticipated. The king himself rose from his seat at the head of the hall, a broad smile spreading across his face as he watched her approach. He was a man known for valuing competence above ceremony, and he had long expressed frustration that the advisor who had done so much good for his kingdom's noble houses remained hidden behind a false name. "Duchess Ashworth," the king said warmly, his voice carrying easily across the now silent ballroom. "Or should I say, Mr. Ashford, I confess I have been eager to finally place a face to the letters that arrived so faithfully these past 2 years." Clara offered a graceful curtsy before the king, her voice clear and composed as she replied, "Your Majesty, I hope my discretion has not caused offense. I found that my counsel was received more readily when my name did not precede it." A ripple of soft laughter moved through the nearest guests, an appreciative acknowledgement of both her honesty and her cleverness. The king chuckled as well, nodding with evident approval. "A wise strategy and one that has served this kingdom well," he said. "Tonight, however, discretion has run its course. It is time the realm knew the name of the woman who saved the Hartley shipping fortune, restored the Pemberton estate, and quietly rebuilt the Caldwell family's standing after their near collapse." At the mention of his family's name, Lord Henry Caldwell felt his knees weaken slightly beneath him. He stared at Clara with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and overwhelming gratitude, memories flooding back of the anonymous letters that had arrived at precisely the moments his family needed them most, always signed with the same careful hand, always offering solutions his own advisors had failed to see. He moved through the crowd almost without realizing it, drawn toward the space where Clara now stood near the king, and when he finally reached her, he bowed deeply, far more deeply than etiquette strictly required. "Duchess Ashworth," he said, his voice unsteady with emotion, "I owe my family's survival to your counsel. I have spent a year wondering who Mr. Ashford truly was, imagining some clever merchant or retired banker. I never once considered that the answer had been standing beside my closest friend all along." Clara offered him a gentle, genuine smile, the first fully unguarded expression she had allowed herself since arriving. "Your family's resilience did the true work, Lord Caldwell. I simply offered a path forward. It was your willingness to walk it that saved your name." Henry shook his head, still visibly moved. "You are too modest, Your Grace. I only wish I had known sooner so that I might have thanked you properly and perhaps—" He paused, glancing briefly toward Edmund, who still stood frozen near the edge of the crowd, "so that I might have understood who my closest friend was fortunate enough to marry." The words landed with quiet weight, and several guests nearby exchanged knowing glances, understanding fully now the reason for Edmund's earlier absence of his wife from the evening's arrangements. Edmund, still standing beside a visibly shaken Seraphina, felt the eyes of the ballroom shifting toward him, curiosity and quiet judgment mingling in equal measure. He had spent years believing himself burdened by an unremarkable wife, a woman whose presence he had considered a liability to his standing among his peers. Now, standing in the very ballroom where he had hoped to restore his pride through another woman's company, he watched as that same wife received the open admiration and gratitude of the king himself. Seraphina, sensing the sudden and complete collapse of the evening's intended purpose, attempted to recover some measure of composure, though her voice carried an unmistakable edge when she finally spoke. "How extraordinary," she said, forcing a thin smile as she watched Clara continue to converse warmly with several approaching nobles eager to express their own gratitude for her assistance. "I confess I had no idea the Duchess possessed such hidden talents." "Nor did I," Edmund admitted quietly, his voice barely audible even to himself. He watched as more guests approached Clara, each one offering praise, gratitude, or simple astonished admiration, the ballroom transforming around her presence in a way he had never witnessed in all their years of marriage. She had always been quiet in public settings, careful and reserved, and Edmund had mistaken that quietness for something lesser, some deficiency he needed to compensate for. He understood now, watching her navigate this sudden attention with calm grace, that her quietness had never been weakness. It had been patience, discipline, and a depth of character he had simply failed to notice. The king raised a hand, calling for the attention of the room once more. "In recognition of her invaluable service to the stability of this kingdom's noble houses, I hereby name Duchess Clara Ashworth as the Crown's official trade envoy, a position that shall grant her direct counsel with the royal treasury on matters of noble estate management." The announcement drew a fresh wave of astonished applause, guests raising their glasses in genuine tribute as Clara accepted the honor with a composed bow of gratitude. It was an appointment of significant prestige, one that would place her name and judgment at the center of the kingdom's financial affairs for years to come. Edmund watched the applause continue to swell around him, feeling smaller with each passing moment, the carefully constructed image of the evening he had planned crumbling entirely away. He had come to this ball intent on erasing the embarrassment he associated with his marriage, and instead, he now stood as the man who had failed to recognize the remarkable woman he had married, choosing instead to hide her away out of misplaced shame. As the formal announcements concluded and the orchestra resumed its music, guests began approaching Clara in a steady stream, eager to speak with the woman whose quiet brilliance had so thoroughly reshaped the evening's expectations. Clara handled each conversation with practiced ease, drawing on the same composure she had cultivated through years of careful correspondence and quiet study. It was several minutes before Edmund finally found the courage to approach her himself, weaving through the crowd of admirers with a heaviness in his steps that had nothing to do with his usual confident stride. When he finally stood before her, the surrounding guests seemed to sense the moment's significance, several conversations quieting as attention shifted subtly toward the Duke and Duchess standing face to face for the first time that evening. "Clara," Edmund said quietly, his voice lacking its usual composed authority, "I did not know." Clara regarded him steadily, her expression calm but carrying a depth of quiet strength that had not been present in her eyes when they had first married. "No," she agreed softly. "You did not know because you never once asked." The words carried no anger, only a plain and undeniable truth, and Edmund found he had no response to offer in return. He stood there, surrounded by the glittering lights and admiring whispers of a ballroom that had once represented everything he believed he needed to reclaim, and understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, exactly how much he had failed to see. The music continued to swell through the grand hall, but for Edmund, it felt distant, as though he stood behind a thick pane of glass separating him from the celebration unfolding around his own wife. He remained near Clara for a long moment, unsure of what to say next, while a steady stream of nobles continued approaching her with congratulations and quiet expressions of gratitude. Lady Margaret Ellsworth, an elderly widow known throughout court for her sharp tongue and even sharper judgment of character, approached Clara with a look of open admiration rarely seen on her weathered face. "Duchess Ashworth," she said, taking Clara's hand warmly between her own, "I have sat through 100 balls in my lifetime, and I do not believe I have ever witnessed an entrance quite so remarkable. You have given every woman in this room a great deal to consider about the difference between appearance and substance." Clara inclined her head graciously. "You are very kind, Lady Ellsworth." "Kindness has little to do with it, my dear," the older woman replied, her sharp eyes flicking briefly toward Edmund before returning to Clara. "I speak only the truth. It seems your husband has been keeping quite a treasure hidden away, whether he intended to or not." The comment, though delivered with apparent good humor, landed with a quiet sting that Edmund felt fully, and he offered the older woman a tight, uncomfortable smile before she moved along to greet other guests. Nearby, Serafina stood somewhat apart from the gathering crowd, her earlier confidence entirely dissolved beneath the weight of the evening's revelations. She had come to this ball believing herself the center of attention, the beautiful companion elevating a duke standing among his peers. Instead, she now watched as every eye in the room turned toward a woman she had long dismissed as unremarkable, a woman whose quiet brilliance had utterly eclipsed her carefully cultivated beauty. She approached Clara eventually, forcing a smile onto her face as she navigated the delicate social terrain the evening had created. "Duchess Ashworth," she said, her voice carrying a practiced warmth that did not quite reach her eyes. "What a truly remarkable surprise this evening has been. I confess I had never imagined you possessed such talents." "There was little reason for you to imagine it," Clara replied evenly, her tone polite but carrying an unmistakable steadiness beneath its surface courtesy. "I kept my work private for reasons of my own." Serafina's smile tightened slightly at the composed response, clearly having expected either flustered gratitude or defensive explanation, neither of which Clara offered. "Well, I do hope there are no hard feelings regarding this evening's arrangements. Your husband simply thought." "I am aware of what my husband thought," Clara interrupted gently, though her voice remained calm and free of visible anger. "There is no need to explain it further. I heard the conversation myself some days ago." The color drained slightly from Serafina's face as she realized the full implication of Clara's words, understanding now that Clara had known of Edmund's plans well before this evening had begun, and had chosen, quite deliberately, to arrive precisely as she had. Whatever advantage Serafina had believed herself to hold evaporated entirely in that moment, replaced instead by the uncomfortable awareness that she had been, in some sense, a pawn within a much larger unfolding truth she had never anticipated. Serafina excused herself soon after, retreating toward the refreshment tables with far less grace than she had displayed upon her arrival, while Edmund remained standing near his wife, feeling increasingly like a stranger within his own marriage. As the evening progressed, Clara found herself drawn into deeper conversation with several members of the Royal Treasury Council, men who had long admired the anonymous counsel of Mr. Ashford, and were eager now to discuss the details of her new role as trade envoy. She answered their questions with the same careful precision that had characterized her private correspondence for years, her knowledge of trade routes, estate management, and financial restructuring evident in every measured response she offered. Edmund listened from a short distance away, unable to fully participate in conversations that had, until this evening, existed entirely outside his awareness of his own wife's capabilities. He realized with a growing discomfort that he knew almost nothing of Clara's true intellect or interests. He had spent 3 years married to a woman he had never truly attempted to understand, content instead to view her through the narrow lens of her plain appearance and quiet demeanor, mistaking silence for emptiness, rather than recognizing it as depth. Lord Henry Caldwell approached him at one point during the evening, his expression carrying a mixture of concern and gentle reproach, as he studied his old friend's uncharacteristically subdued posture. "You look as though you have seen a ghost, Edmund," Henry said, though his tone carried more sympathy than mockery. "Perhaps I have," Edmund admitted quietly. "I believed I understood my own wife, Henry. I understood nothing at all." Henry regarded him for a long moment before responding. "I have known you many years, my friend, and I have never known you to be a cruel man, only sometimes a foolish one, blinded by the expectations placed upon you since birth. But I would advise you to consider carefully what you intend to do now that the truth has finally revealed itself." Edmund did not respond immediately, his gaze drifting once more toward Clara, who stood several paces away, composed and confident amid a circle of admiring nobles, looking every bit the woman the title of Duchess had always promised, but that he had never allowed her the opportunity to become in his eyes. As the ball continued deep into the evening, the orchestra shifted into a slower, more formal piece, traditionally reserved for the evening's most significant dance, one typically shared between hosts of particular importance. The king himself approached Clara with a warm smile, extending his hand in invitation. "Duchess Ashworth, would you honor me with this dance? It seems only fitting, given the evening's revelations." Clara accepted gracefully, and as the king led her onto the dance floor, the surrounding guests parted respectfully to allow them space, watching with evident admiration as the woman who had entered the evening as a quiet mystery now moved through its center with poised, unmistakable confidence. Edmund watched from the edge of the dance floor, feeling a strange and unfamiliar ache settle within his chest, one he slowly recognized with some discomfort as regret. He had spent this ball anticipating relief from embarrassment, and instead found himself confronted with the painful realization that the embarrassment had never truly belonged to Clara at all. It had belonged entirely to him, born from his own shallow judgment and his failure to look beyond the surface of the woman he had married. As the dance concluded and polite applause rippled across the hall, Clara returned to a quieter corner of the ballroom, accepting a glass of wine from a passing servant, finally allowing herself a brief moment of solitude amid the evening's overwhelming attention. It was there that Edmund finally found the courage to approach her once more, his earlier hesitation giving way to a quiet, determined resolve to say what needed to be said, regardless of how difficult the words might prove. "Clara," he began softly, "might I have a moment of your time?" She studied him for a long moment, her expression neither cold nor warm, simply measured and calm before finally offering a small nod. "Of course, Edmund." They stepped away from the main crowd, moving toward a quiet balcony overlooking the palace gardens, the cool night air a welcome relief after the warmth and noise of the ballroom. The moon hung low over the manicured hedges below, casting soft silver light across the stone railing where they now stood, several careful feet of distance still separating them despite the intimacy of the setting. "I owe you an apology," Edmund said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "A far greater one than I know how to properly express." Clara said nothing at first, simply watching him with an expression that gave little away, waiting to hear whatever he intended to say next before offering any response of her own. The garden below the balcony lay quiet and still, the moonlight tracing pale silver lines along the neatly trimmed hedges, and for a long moment neither Edmund nor Clara spoke, the distant sound of music and laughter from the ballroom drifting faintly through the open doors behind them. "I have spent 3 years married to you," Edmund finally continued, his voice carrying a rawness Clara had never heard from him before, "and I never once asked you what you thought, what you wanted, or what you did with your days when I was not present. I told myself I was being respectful of your privacy, but the truth is far less generous than that. I simply did not think you had anything worth discovering." Clara studied him carefully, her expression calm but unwavering. "That is a difficult thing to admit, Edmund." "It is the truth," he said, "and I find I can no longer avoid it, not after tonight. I have spent this entire evening watching my own wife receive the admiration of the king, of the Treasury Council, of men far more accomplished than myself, and I understood, watching you, that I had built my entire opinion of you upon nothing more than a first impression I never bothered to question." Clara turned slightly, looking out over the moonlit garden rather than directly at him, her fingers resting lightly against the cool stone railing. "Do you know what it felt like, Edmund, to stand outside your study door and hear you tell Lord Caldwell that you were tired of watching men's faces when they realized I was not the woman they expected? Do you know what it felt like to understand that my own husband considered me an embarrassment to be managed, rather than a person worthy of his honesty?" Edmund's jaw tightened, the memory of his own careless words returning to him with painful clarity. "I did not know you heard that conversation." "I heard every word," Clara said, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was revealing. "And in that moment I made a decision. I decided that I would no longer wait for your approval to feel worthy of my own life. I had already begun building something for myself, quietly, in the hours when you were absent, but that conversation was what convinced me to see it fully realized, rather than remain hidden simply to spare your discomfort. And you succeeded beyond anything I could have imagined," Edmund said quietly, a note of genuine admiration entering his voice despite the guilt still evident beneath it. "The Hartley family, the Pemberton estate, Henry's own family fortune, all rescued by your hand, and I knew nothing of it. I am ashamed, Clara, not only of my words that day, but of every day before it, when I failed to see the woman standing directly in front of me." Clara turned back toward him then, her gaze steady and searching, as though weighing the sincerity of his words against the years of quiet neglect that had preceded them. "Shame is easy to feel in a moment such as this, Edmund, surrounded by admiration you did not expect me to receive. The question is whether that feeling will last beyond tonight, once the ball has ended and the whispers have faded into the ordinary rhythm of our lives again." "I do not know how to answer that in a way that will convince you," Edmund admitted, his voice quiet and unusually humble. "I can only tell you that I intend to try, if you will allow me the chance." Clara considered his words carefully, the cool night air settling gently around them as the distant music continued to play. She thought of the years she had spent quietly building her own worth, separate entirely from her marriage, and she understood clearly that whatever came next would need to be built on far more honest ground than the arrangement that had first brought them together. "I am not the same woman you married 3 years ago, Edmund," she said finally. "I do not intend to return to being quiet and invisible simply because you have finally chosen to notice me. If we are to move forward from this evening, it will need to be as equals, not as a duke, and the wife he has decided is finally acceptable to acknowledge." "I understand," Edmund said, and for the first time that evening, his voice carried none of the practiced composure he usually wore like armor. "I do not ask you to forgive me tonight, Clara. I only ask that you allow me the opportunity to become a man worthy of the wife I have clearly failed to appreciate." Before Clara could respond further, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their conversation, and both turned to find Lord Henry Caldwell stepping out onto the balcony, his expression apologetic as he realized he had interrupted a private moment. "Forgive me," Henry said quickly, "I did not mean to intrude. I only wish to speak with Duchess Ashworth briefly, if she is willing." Clara offered him a gentle smile, grateful for the brief reprieve from the weight of her conversation with Edmund. "Of course, Lord Caldwell." Henry stepped further onto the balcony, his earlier composure giving way to genuine emotion as he addressed her directly. "I wanted to thank you properly, Duchess Ashworth, away from the crowd and the formality of the ballroom. My family's survival is owed entirely to your counsel, and I confess I am still struggling to comprehend that the brilliant advisor I corresponded with for over a year was, in truth, the wife of my closest friend." "Your gratitude is appreciated, Lord Caldwell," Clara replied warmly, "though I would remind you that it was your family's resilience that ultimately secured your recovery. I merely offered guidance." "You offered far more than guidance," Henry insisted gently. "You offered hope at a time when we had very little left. I only regret that I did not know sooner who deserved my thanks, so that I might have offered it properly, rather than allowing you to remain hidden in the shadows of a marriage that clearly failed to recognize your worth." The comment, though directed toward Clara, carried an unmistakable weight aimed also at Edmund, who stood quietly beside them, absorbing the words without argument, understanding fully that he had earned every ounce of implicit criticism carried within his friend's gentle rebuke. As Henry excused himself once more, leaving Edmund and Clara alone on the balcony, the distant sound of the orchestra shifted into a final, sweeping melody, signaling the approach of the evening's conclusion. Clara glanced back toward the ballroom, where the last guests continued to dance beneath the golden light, before turning her attention once more to her husband. "I will not offer you an easy path forward, Edmund," she said finally, her voice carrying quiet resolve rather than bitterness. "But I am willing to allow you the chance to prove that tonight's realization was more than simply admiration born of surprise." Edmund nodded slowly, understanding fully the weight and generosity of what she was offering him, despite years of neglect that would have justified far greater coldness on her part. "That is more than I deserve, Clara, and I intend to honor it." They stood together on the balcony a moment longer, the cool night air settling quietly around them, the distant music continuing to drift through the open doors behind them, and for the first time since their wedding day, Edmund found himself truly looking at his wife, not as an obligation fulfilled through arranged circumstance, but as a woman whose depth and strength he was only now beginning to understand. The ball would soon draw to its close, but for both of them, the true beginning of their story, one built on honesty rather than quiet resignation, was only just starting to take shape beneath the moonlit sky. The weeks following the royal ball brought a steady stream of change to Wexbury Manor, though not the sudden, dramatic transformation one might expect from a story of this kind. Clara had made it clear from the very beginning that trust, once broken through years of quiet neglect, could not be rebuilt through a single evening of admiration or a handful of well-intentioned words spoken beneath moonlight. Edmund understood this, and to his credit, he did not attempt to rush what could not be rushed. In the days after the ball, he began, slowly and somewhat awkwardly, to involve himself in aspects of Clara's life he had previously ignored entirely. He asked about her work as the Crown's new trade envoy, listening carefully as she explained the details of estate restructuring and trade negotiation, subjects he had never once considered discussing with her before that evening. At first, Clara answered his questions with polite but guarded brevity, unwilling to fully open the doors she had spent years building around her private accomplishments. She had grown accustomed to managing her life independently, and the sudden shift toward shared conversation felt, at times, unfamiliar and even slightly uncomfortable. "You do not need to pretend interest in matters you find tedious, Edmund," she told him one evening, as they sat together in the manor's small library, a space Clara had always preferred for its quiet warmth. "I am not pretending," Edmund replied, setting aside the ledger she had been explaining. "I find that I am genuinely curious, Clara, though I understand my curiosity arrives rather late to be of much comfort to you." Clara studied him for a long moment, searching his expression for any sign of the careless indifference that had once characterized their interactions. She found instead a quiet sincerity that had not been present in the earlier years of their marriage, and slowly, cautiously, she allowed herself to believe that his effort was genuine rather than simply the fleeting guilt of a man embarrassed by public exposure. Word of Clara's true identity, as Mr. Ashford, spread quickly through the kingdom's noble circles in the weeks following the ball, and with it came a steady stream of requests for her counsel, families eager to benefit from the same careful guidance that had rescued the Hartley, Pemberton, and Caldwell estates. Clara found herself busier than ever, balancing her new formal duties as trade envoy with the private correspondence she had long maintained under her borrowed name, though she no longer felt any need to hide behind it. Seraphina Vale, meanwhile, found her own social standing shifting uncomfortably in the aftermath of the ball. Whispers followed her through gatherings she had once dominated with ease, quiet murmurs questioning her judgment in accompanying a married duke to such a significant event, and her attempts to distance herself from the evening's embarrassment did little to fully repair the damage done to her reputation. She eventually withdrew from court society for a time, retreating to her family's countryside estate to allow the whispers to fade with distance and time. Lord Henry Caldwell, for his part, became one of Clara's most vocal and genuine supporters within noble circles, ensuring that her contributions received proper recognition wherever her name arose in conversation. His gratitude toward her remained steady and sincere, and he often visited Wexbury Manor in the following months, ostensibly to discuss matters of trade with Edmund, though Clara suspected his visits carried an additional purpose of quietly observing how his friend's marriage continued to evolve. "You seem different, Edmund," Henry remarked during one such visit, as the two men sat together in the manor's study, a bottle of wine between them. "Less guarded, perhaps, less concerned with appearances than you once were." Edmund considered the observation carefully before responding. "I have spent a great deal of time reflecting on the kind of man I wish to be, Henry, particularly in comparison to the kind of man I allowed myself to become out of fear and vanity. It has not been a comfortable process, but I believe it has been a necessary one." "And Clara?" Henry asked, his tone carrying genuine curiosity rather than mere politeness. "How does she find this transformation?" Cautiously, Edmund admitted with a small, rueful smile. "As she should. I do not expect her trust to return quickly, nor do I believe it should. I broke something over the course of 3 years of careless neglect, and I understand that rebuilding it will require considerably more time and effort than a single evening of public humiliation could provide." Henry nodded approvingly, raising his glass slightly in quiet acknowledgement of his friend's honesty. "That, I think, is precisely the right attitude to hold, Edmund. Clara deserves nothing less than genuine, sustained effort, given everything she quietly endured before finally revealing herself." As the months progressed, small but meaningful changes continued to take root within the marriage. Edmund began accompanying Clara to social gatherings not as an obligation to be endured, but as a genuine partner eager to stand beside her publicly, a stark contrast to the man who had once arranged to escort another woman rather than be seen with his own wife. He learned slowly to ask questions rather than assume, to listen rather than dismiss, and to recognize the quiet strength that had always existed within Clara, long before the ball had revealed it to the rest of the kingdom. Clara, in turn, found herself gradually softening toward her husband, not because his past behavior had been forgotten or excused, but because his continued effort over time proved itself to be more than the fleeting guilt of a single embarrassing evening. She watched him engage genuinely with her work, defend her publicly when lingering whispers of doubt occasionally surfaced among more traditional members of court, and treat her, for the first time in their marriage, as a true partner rather than an obligation quietly tolerated. There remained, of course, difficult conversations along the way, moments when old wounds resurfaced unexpectedly, when Clara found herself needing to remind Edmund of past carelessness that continued to sting despite his genuine efforts at change. These conversations were never easy, but Clara noticed, with growing appreciation, that Edmund never grew defensive or dismissive during them, choosing instead to listen fully and acknowledge the pain his earlier actions had caused, without attempting to rush her toward forgiveness before she was ready to offer it. One evening, several months after the ball, as autumn settled gently over the grounds of Wexbury Manor, and the gardens outside their window turned rich shades of amber and gold, Edmund found Clara seated at her familiar writing desk, working through correspondence related to a struggling estate in the northern counties. "May I sit with you?" he asked quietly, a question he would never have thought to voice in the earlier years of their marriage. Clara looked up, studying him for a brief moment before gesturing toward the chair across from her desk. "Of course." He settled into the chair, watching quietly as she continued her work, offering no interruption, simply present in a way he had rarely allowed himself to be before. After several minutes, Clara set down her pen and looked at him with a small, thoughtful expression. "You have been patient these past months, Edmund," she said. "More patient than I perhaps expected, given how our marriage began." "I have a great deal to make amends for," he replied simply. "Patience seems the very least I owe you." Clara considered his words carefully, and for the first time since the ball, something in her expression softened into genuine warmth rather than cautious reserve. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "we might begin again, Edmund, not as strangers bound by arrangement, but as two people choosing this time to truly know one another." Edmund felt something loosen within his chest at her words, a quiet hope he had not allowed himself to fully feel until this moment. "I would like nothing more, Clara," he said softly, "if you will have me." Outside, the autumn wind stirred gently through the manor's gardens, carrying the scent of fallen leaves through the open window, and for the first time in their marriage, both Edmund and Clara felt the quiet beginnings of something real settling steadily between them, built not on obligation or arranged necessity, but on honesty finally allowed to take root. A full year had passed since the night Clara descended the palace staircase and revealed herself as Mr. Ashford before the astonished eyes of the kingdom's noble court, and the changes that single evening had set into motion continued to ripple steadily through both her public work and her private life at Wexbury Manor. Clara's role as trade envoy to the crown had grown considerably in both scope and influence. She now oversaw a small team of advisors who assisted noble families across the kingdom, though she continued to review every significant case personally, unwilling to abandon the careful attention to detail that had earned her reputation in the first place. Her name, once unknown beyond her husband's household, had become synonymous with fair, thoughtful counsel throughout the realm, spoken with respect in circles that had once dismissed her as an unremarkable duchess of little consequence. Edmund, for his part, had continued the steady work of rebuilding trust within his marriage, a process that had required considerably more patience and humility than he had ever previously demonstrated in his life. He no longer attended social functions with any concern for how his marriage might appear to others, choosing instead to stand proudly beside Clara at every gathering, eager to introduce her not as his wife in the formal, distant sense he had once used, but as his partner, his equal, and increasingly, the woman he had come to genuinely admire and love. Their relationship had not transformed overnight, nor had it followed any simple, predictable path toward reconciliation. There had been difficult evenings, honest arguments where old resentments surfaced and needed to be addressed rather than buried beneath polite silence. Clara had insisted, from the very beginning of their renewed relationship, that honesty would need to replace the careful avoidance that had characterized the earlier years of their marriage, and Edmund had honored that request consistently, even when honesty proved uncomfortable for them both. On a bright spring morning, nearly 14 months after the royal ball that had changed everything, Wexbury Manor received an invitation to a new gathering, a modest celebration hosted by Lord Henry Caldwell to mark the full recovery of his family's estate, a recovery made possible entirely through Clara's careful guidance nearly 2 years earlier. "You must both attend," Henry had written in his invitation, his familiar warmth evident even through the formal wording. "It would not feel complete without the two people most responsible for teaching me the true meaning of gratitude and partnership." Clara smiled as she read the letter aloud to Edmund over breakfast, the morning sunlight streaming warmly through the dining room windows. "It seems Henry has not lost his flair for sentiment." "He has always been generous with his affections," Edmund replied with a fond smile, setting down his own correspondence to look across the table at his wife. "Shall we attend together, then?" "Of course," Clara said, and the ease with which she answered, without hesitation or careful calculation, spoke volumes about how far their marriage had traveled since that fateful evening at the palace. The gathering, held on Lord Caldwell's newly restored estate grounds, proved a joyful affair, filled with warm conversation, gentle music, and the easy laughter of guests who had watched over the past year the quiet unfolding of Clara and Edmund's renewed partnership with genuine interest and approval. Even Lady Margaret Ellsworth, sharp-tongued as ever, offered a rare moment of unreserved warmth as she greeted the couple upon their arrival. "Well," the elderly woman said, studying them both with evident satisfaction, "it seems the Duke of Wexbury has finally learned to recognize a treasure when it stands directly before him." Edmund laughed softly, a genuine, easy sound that carried none of the guarded formality he had once worn like armor. "It took me far longer than it should have, Lady Ellsworth, but I believe I have learned the lesson thoroughly." As the celebration continued into the golden hours of the afternoon, Clara found herself standing near the edge of Henry's newly restored gardens, watching the gathered guests mingle happily beneath the warm spring sunlight. Edmund joined her quietly, slipping his hand gently into hers, a small gesture that would have seemed impossible in the earlier years of their marriage, yet now felt entirely natural between them. "Do you ever think of that evening?" Edmund asked softly, watching the gentle breeze stir the newly blooming flowers around them. "The ball, I mean, the moment everything changed." Clara considered the question thoughtfully before responding. "Often, though not with the pain it once carried. I think of it now as the moment I finally allowed myself to be fully seen, rather than the moment my husband failed to see me. It took your failure to reveal my own strength, Edmund, and though I would not choose to relive the pain of that particular lesson, I am grateful for where it has ultimately led us." Edmund squeezed her hand gently, his expression carrying a depth of genuine affection that had grown steadily over the past year, replacing entirely the careless indifference that had once defined their early marriage. "I am grateful as well, Clara, though I remain deeply sorry it required such painful circumstances to finally open my eyes." "The past cannot be changed," Clara said gently, turning to face him fully, her expression warm and open in a way it had never been during the early years of their arranged marriage. "But the future remains entirely within our hands to shape together as equals." Edmund smiled, leaning forward to press a gentle kiss against her forehead, a small but meaningful gesture that spoke of the genuine partnership they had built through months of honest effort and patient rebuilding. "Together, then," he agreed softly. "For as long as you will have me." As the afternoon celebration continued around them, filled with warmth, laughter, and the quiet satisfaction of a story that had traveled from painful beginnings toward genuine partnership, Clara felt, for the first time since her wedding day so many years earlier, that she stood exactly where she belonged, not as a plain wife hidden away out of shame, but as a woman fully known, fully valued, and fully loved for the remarkable person she had always been. Long before the world had finally taken notice. The gardens around them continued to bloom beneath the warm spring sun, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of gentle music drifted through the air, marking not an ending, but the steady, hopeful continuation of a partnership finally built upon honesty, respect, and the kind of quiet strength that no title or appearance could ever fully capture on its own. 3 years after the royal ball that had once threatened to end her marriage before it had truly begun, Clara Ashworth stood at the entrance of a newly established institution bearing her own name, a modest but growing academy dedicated to teaching estate management and trade principles to young women who, like her, had once been dismissed as unlikely to possess any talent for such matters. The Ashworth Academy for Trade and Estate Management had opened its doors only months earlier, funded partly through Clara's own earnings as trade envoy and partly through generous contributions from families she had helped over the years, including a particularly enthusiastic donation from Lord Henry Caldwell, who had never forgotten the debt his family owed to her quiet brilliance. Edmund stood beside her that morning, watching with evident pride as the first group of students arrived, young women from families both noble and common, drawn by Clara's growing reputation and the rare opportunity to learn skills that society had long insisted belonged exclusively to men. "You have built something remarkable, Clara," Edmund said quietly, watching the students gather in the academy's newly constructed courtyard. "Something that will outlast both of us." Clara smiled, a warmth in her expression that had grown steadily more natural over the years since their difficult beginning. "I only wish to offer other women the chance I nearly missed, the chance to discover their own worth without waiting for someone else to notice it first." Their marriage had continued to deepen in the years following the ball, weathering the ordinary challenges that any genuine partnership eventually faced. There had been disagreements, moments of frustration, and occasional reminders of the painful early years that had shaped their union. But through it all, both Edmund and Clara had remained committed to the honesty they had promised one another that autumn evening in the Manor library. Their family had grown as well. 2 years after the ball, Clara had given birth to a daughter, whom they named Elena after Clara's own mother, a gentle woman who had passed away when Clara was still quite young. Elena had inherited her mother's quiet, observant nature, along with a curiosity that Edmund often joked would one day rival Clara's own remarkable mind. Edmund had changed considerably from the proud, image-conscious Duke, who had once arranged to escort another woman to a royal ball rather than face the perceived embarrassment of his own wife's plain appearance. He had learned, through years of deliberate effort, to value substance over appearance, character over convenience, and honesty over the careful management of public perception that had once governed nearly every decision he made. He had also become one of the Academy's most vocal supporters, using his own standing among the nobility to encourage other noble families to send their daughters for instruction, gently challenging the deeply rooted assumptions that had once shaped his own early treatment of Clara. It was not uncommon, in the years following the ball, for Edmund to be heard defending the intelligence and capability of women in conversations with other noblemen, drawing occasionally on his own painful example as evidence of how easily such capability could be overlooked by those unwilling to look beyond surface appearances. Lord Henry Caldwell remained a close and constant friend throughout these years, his family's estate flourishing steadily under the continued benefit of Clara's early guidance. He often visited Wexbury Manor with his own growing family, and the warmth between the two households had become one of the most stable and cherished relationships in both their lives, a friendship built genuinely on gratitude, respect, and shared history rather than mere social convenience. Seraphina Vale, meanwhile, had eventually returned to court society, though considerably humbled by the experience of the royal ball and the whispers that had followed her for many months afterward. She had in time found her own path forward, marrying a respectable gentleman from the northern counties and settling into a quieter, less socially ambitious life than she had once envisioned for herself. Clara harbored no lingering resentment toward her, understanding that Seraphina, too, had been shaped by a society that placed far too much value on appearance and far too little on genuine character, a lesson Clara herself had learned through considerably more painful means. On the evening of the Academy's official opening ceremony, held some months after that first quiet morning of student arrivals, Clara stood once more before a gathered crowd, though this time the setting carried none of the anxious uncertainty that had once characterized her arrival at the royal ball. She stood instead with the calm confidence of a woman who had long since proven her own worth, both to herself and to a kingdom that had once been quick to underestimate her. "When I was a young woman," Clara said, addressing the gathered crowd of students, families, and dignitaries who had come to witness the Academy's formal opening, "I was told in ways both spoken and unspoken that my value lay chiefly in my usefulness to others, in the debts I might settle through marriage, in the quiet obedience expected of a woman in my position. I was not encouraged to believe that my own mind held any particular worth beyond these narrow expectations." She paused, glancing briefly toward Edmund, who stood near the front of the gathered crowd with young Alina perched happily on his shoulders, watching her mother with wide, admiring eyes. "It took a painful lesson, one I would not wish upon any of you, to finally understand that my worth had never depended upon anyone else's recognition of it. I built something real, something valuable entirely apart from the expectations placed upon me, and I did so not because I sought approval, but because I refused to accept that my own capabilities deserved to remain hidden simply because the world had not yet learned to look for them." The crowd listened in respectful silence, many of the young students present nodding quietly in recognition of sentiments they themselves had long carried without the words to properly express them. "This Academy exists," Clara continued, "so that none of you need wait for a painful lesson to discover your own worth. I hope you will leave these halls not only with practical skills in trade and estate management, but with the certain knowledge that your capabilities were never in question, only waiting for the opportunity to be properly recognized and developed." As the ceremony concluded, and the gathered crowd began to disperse into quiet conversation and celebration, Edmund made his way toward Clara, young Alina still perched happily upon his shoulders, her small hands clapping enthusiastically at the conclusion of her mother's speech. "You continue to surprise me, even after all these years," Edmund said softly, lowering Alina gently to the ground as she ran off to join a small group of children playing near the Academy's newly planted garden. "I should hope so," Clara replied with a gentle, teasing smile, the easy warmth between them now as natural as breathing after years of careful, honest rebuilding. "A marriage without a little surprise would grow rather dull, I think." Edmund laughed, taking her hand gently in his own as they watched their daughter play in the golden evening light, the academy's newly constructed halls rising proudly behind them, a testament to everything Clara had built from the quiet ashes of a marriage that had once nearly crumbled beneath the weight of pride, shame, and careless assumption. "I love you, Clara," Edmund said quietly, the words carrying none of the formal distance that had once characterized their earliest years together, spoken instead with the full weight of genuine devotion earned through years of deliberate, honest effort. "Not because of what you have accomplished, though I am endlessly proud of it, but simply for who you are and who you have always been, long before I finally learned to see it clearly." Clara turned to him, her expression soft with genuine affection, the painful memory of that royal ball now transformed, through years of patient rebuilding, into the very foundation upon which their true partnership had ultimately been built. "And I love you, Edmund," she said quietly, "for the man you chose to become even after everything that came before." Together they watched the sun set gently over the academy grounds, the golden light stretching long shadows across the courtyard where dozens of young women had begun, that very day, the same quiet journey toward self-discovery that had once transformed Clara's own life so completely. Their story, born from painful beginnings and careless assumption, had grown into something far greater than either of them could have imagined on that difficult wedding day so many years earlier, a partnership built not on arrangement or obligation, but on the hard-earned foundation of honesty, respect, and love finally allowed to flourish fully between them.